When my son called me selfish, I didn't argue. I just stood there, in the middle of the kitchen I'd once built for his childhood meals, and smiled the kind of smile that hides 1,000 little heartbreaks. He didn't even look up from his phone when he said it. "Mom, not everything has to be about you." Those words fell so casually, like crumbs brushed off a table. But they didn't land lightly. They sank deep. I wanted to tell him that everything I had ever done was about him. His school lunches, his late-night fevers, the way I worked extra shifts so he could have the good shoes other kids wore. But I didn't say anything, because sometimes silence feels safer than truth. I remember that day clearly. The rain had been falling since morning, soft and steady, tapping against the kitchen window like it was trying to remind me of something I'd forgotten. Maybe it was trying to remind me of the woman I used to be. When I was younger, I thought motherhood was like building a house. Every meal, every bedtime story, every small sacrifice was a brick. I thought that if I built carefully, with love and patience, the walls would hold forever. But no one tells you that children grow up and build their own houses, sometimes on the ruins of yours. My son Daniel was my only child. His father Mark was a kind man, but quiet, too quiet sometimes. We lived in a small town where everyone knew each other's business, but pretended they didn't. Mark worked as a mechanic, and I ran a small tailoring shop from home. Our home was modest, but always smelled of something warm: fresh bread, ironed cotton, soap drying on the balcony. Life was simple, and in its simplicity, it felt whole. Daniel was a bright boy, curious, polite, always asking questions about how things worked. When he was 10, he'd follow Mark to the garage and hand him tools like a little apprentice. And when he came home, he'd sit beside me while I sewed. "Mom, why do you always hum when you work?" he once asked. "Because," I told him, "when your hands are busy, your heart gets quiet." He didn't understand then. Maybe he still doesn't. The years passed like pages turning too quickly. Mark's health began to fade. He was diagnosed with heart disease when Daniel was in high school. I remember sitting in the hospital hallway, listening to the machines beeping, wondering how I'd keep everything together. After Mark passed away, Daniel changed. He became more serious, more determined to leave our small town. He wanted to study engineering in the city. I wanted to keep him close, but I also wanted him to see the world. So I sold my shop, used the savings for his college tuition, and moved into a smaller apartment. I told myself it was fine, that this is what mothers do. We trade pieces of our lives for our children's futures, little by little, until one day there's nothing left to trade. In the beginning, Daniel called every night. He'd tell me about his classes, his new friends, how the city lights never really went out. I'd sit by the window, phone pressed to my ear, smiling at the sound of his voice echoing through my empty apartment. But slowly, the calls became shorter, then less frequent, until one day they stopped altogether. I tried not to worry. I told myself he was busy, that this was normal. But mothers know. We always know when distance isn't just about miles. When he did call, it was usually because he needed something: money, advice, a recipe he couldn't remember. And I gave it all freely, because giving was how I loved. The first time I met his girlfriend Lily, I was nervous. She was polite, pretty, and soft-spoken, but there was a wall between us I couldn't see through. Every time I offered to help or ask about her family, she smiled in that careful way people do when they're being polite but distant. Still, I was hopeful. I thought maybe, in time, we'd grow close. When they got married, I helped plan everything: sewing her dress, arranging flowers, even cooking half the food for the reception. I wanted it to be perfect for them. I wanted Daniel to feel proud. And he did, for a while. But after the wedding, I started to feel like a guest in my own son's life. When they moved into their new house, I helped unpack. I remember placing the dishes in neat stacks, folding towels, arranging curtains. It was Lily who said, softly but clearly, "Thank you, but we'll take it from here." Her tone wasn't rude. It was final. And in that moment, I realized my hands weren't needed anymore. So I stepped back. I tried to let them live their lives, but letting go isn't something you learn overnight, especially when your entire identity has been built around caring. A few months later, I fell ill. It wasn't serious, just fatigue and dizziness from years of ignoring myself. I called Daniel to tell him, hoping for a little comfort. He said he'd come by on the weekend. He didn't. I told myself it was fine. He had work, responsibilities. But as I sat by the window again, listening to the same rain tap against the glass, I felt the quiet kind of loneliness that doesn't shout. It just settles. When Daniel finally visited, it was to tell me that he and Lily were expecting a baby. I was overjoyed. I hugged him, cried a little, and thanked God for giving our family another chance at love. He smiled, awkwardly, like someone unsure of what to do with someone else's emotions. I started knitting, mall sweaters, preparing soups, collecting stories I'd one day tell my grandchild. But when the baby arrived, I wasn't called. I saw the photos online before I saw the child in person. When I finally visited, Lily greeted me kindly but firmly. "Mom, please understand. We just need some time as a family." I nodded, smiled, handed over the tiny sweater I'd made, then walked home in the rain, holding the empty feeling like a fragile secret. And that brings me back to the day he called me selfish. It happened because I'd offered to move closer, to help with the baby, to cook, to make their lives easier. But he said no. He said they needed space, that I was making things about me. I wanted to scream, "Do you even know what it means to give everything?" But instead I just said, "I understand." Because mothers are trained to understand, even when they're breaking. That night, I sat by the same window I'd sat by years ago, staring at the reflection of a woman who looked familiar, but not quite the same. Her hair was grayer, her hands more wrinkled, but her heart still waited for a call that might never come. Sometimes I think about all the things I never said, how I let love turn into quiet duty, how I gave so much that I forgot I could ask for anything in return. And maybe that's what selfishness looks like, from the outside. A mother still wanting to matter. After that day, something inside me went quiet. Not angry, not bitter, just quiet. Like a song that used to play in the background of my life had slowly faded out. I still called Daniel every few days, though I started to notice how each conversation felt shorter, more polite. He would say, "Mom, we're fine. Everything's good." And I would reply, "That's wonderful, dear. I'm just happy to hear your voice." I always said that, happy to hear your voice, even when the silence between his words grew longer. Sometimes I'd hang up and stare at my phone, wishing there was a way to rewind time, to the years when his voice was filled with laughter and need, when he used to say, "Mom, don't hang up yet," because he didn't want to go to bed. Now, I was the one who didn't want to hang up. The days grew slower after that. My mornings began with tea and the sound of neighbors' children running off to school. In the evenings, I'd walk to the park, where old couples sat feeding birds, and mothers watched their toddlers chase pigeons. I watched quietly. There's something bittersweet about watching strangers live the life you once had. Sometimes I'd knit tiny clothes, sweaters, socks, little hats, even when no one asked for them. It gave my hands something to do. Because when your hands are busy, your heart hurts less. I told myself I was preparing gifts for my granddaughter. Her name was Emma. A beautiful name. I whispered it to myself often, like a prayer I didn't want to forget. One afternoon, I decided to visit Daniel and Lily. I didn't call ahead. I baked an apple pie, his favorite since childhood, and took a cab across town. As I stood at their door, pie warm in my hands, I felt both nervous and hopeful. Maybe they'd smile. Maybe Emma would reach for me. Maybe we'd sit together like family again. But when Lily opened the door, surprise flickered across her face, followed by discomfort. "Oh, hi, Mom," she said softly. "We weren't expecting you." Her tone wasn't rude, but it wasn't warm either. Daniel appeared behind her, holding the baby. He looked tired, older, but when his eyes met mine, they didn't soften. "Mom," he said, "you should have called first. We were just putting Emma down for her nap." "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "I just wanted to drop by. I made you pie." He hesitated. Lily looked at him. Then she said, "That's very sweet. Thank you." There was a pause, the kind that tells you it's time to go. I stood there for another moment, pie still in my hands, unsure what to do. Then Daniel reached for it and said, "Thanks, Mom. We'll enjoy it later." I smiled, nodded, and whispered, "Of course," then turned around and walked back down the steps. The cab driver looked at me through the rear-view mirror. He saw the pie tin still in my lap. "Did they like it?" he asked kindly. I forced a smile. "They will," I said. But deep down, I knew they wouldn't even taste it. That evening, I couldn't eat. I sat by the window again. That same window that had seen me through every joy and heartbreak. Outside, the streetlights flickered, and somewhere in the distance, a baby cried. Maybe it was Emma, maybe not. But I imagined it was her, calling for the comfort of arms that would never be mine. I took a deep breath and whispered to the night, "Maybe I expected too much." Weeks passed. Then one morning, I received a message from Daniel. "Mom, Lily and I are planning Emma's first birthday next weekend. It'll be a small thing. We'll let you know if we need help." My heart jumped. Maybe this was the moment things would change. I spent the next few days sewing a small pink dress, soft as rose petals. I wrapped it in tissue paper, tied it with a ribbon, and waited for the invitation. But it never came. I saw photos online again, balloons, a cake, laughter, and Emma in the dress I'd made. Except the sleeves had been altered. Lily must have changed them. It didn't matter. What mattered was that she'd worn it. Still, I couldn't stop my eyes from watering, not because I wasn't there, but because I'd become a quiet footnote in my own story. A week later, Daniel called. "Mom, I saw your comment on the photo," he said, his voice firm. "I just said the dress looked lovely," I replied. "I know," he sighed. "But Lily feels like you're trying to make everything about you again. Please, just let us handle things our way." There it was again. That word. Selfish. I bit my lip. I wanted to say, "You have no idea how much of myself I gave up for you," but instead I said softly, "I understand." When the call ended, I sat in silence, and for the first time, I realized how heavy love can be when it's not returned. That night, I opened an old photo album. Daniel as a baby, Daniel in his school uniform, Daniel's wedding day. Each page felt like another piece of myself, moments I'd built carefully, lovingly, believing they would mean something forever. I ran my fingers over his baby photo and whispered, "Where did we go wrong, my love?" But there was no answer, only the sound of rain again. As the months went by, I stopped calling so often, not out of pride, but out of exhaustion. There's a special kind of tiredness that comes from caring too much for too long. Instead, I began writing letters. Not to send, just to write. Letters to Daniel, letters to Emma, letters to the woman I used to be, I wrote things like, "Today I made your favorite soup. I remembered how you used to ask for seconds." Or, "Emma, when you're old enough to understand, I hope you know your grandmother loved you from afar." I kept the letters in a small wooden box near my bed. It felt like keeping pieces of my love safe somewhere, just in case anyone ever wanted to find them. One afternoon, as I was returning from the market, I saw Daniel standing by my building's gate. I hadn't seen him in weeks. My heart lifted. "Daniel," I said, smiling. "What a surprise." He smiled weakly. "Hey, Mom, can we talk?" I invited him in. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd done his homework as a child. I poured him tea, just like I used to, but he didn't touch it. "Mom," he began carefully, "Lily and I have been talking. We're planning to move to another city. I got a new job." My hands froze. "Oh," I said softly. "That's wonderful news." He nodded. "Yeah, it's a great opportunity, but it means we won't be able to visit as often." The words stung, though I tried to smile. Through them. "I understand," I said. He hesitated, then added, "Also, Lily thinks it might be best if you don't call too much. It stresses her out. She feels like she's being watched." That one hurt more than I can describe. "Watched?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. "I know you don't mean to," he said quickly, "but you message a lot. It just feels overwhelming sometimes." I wanted to tell him that mothers don't watch. They worry. But all I could say was, "I see." He reached across the table, briefly touching my hand. "I love you, Mom," he said softly. "I just need you to trust me. Okay?" I nodded. "Of course." He stood, hugged me quickly, and left. The sound of the door closing was sharper than I expected. And when it did, I realized something. It wasn't just the door that had closed. It was a chapter. That night, I sat alone, staring at the tea he never drank. It had gone cold, untouched, just like all the little gestures of love I kept offering. I whispered to the quiet room. After everything I did, he still called me selfish. The words finally came out, trembling but honest, and with them came tears I had held back for years. I cried not just for him, but for myself, for the woman who had given everything and still felt invisible, for the mother who kept loving, even when love no longer had a place to go. In that moment, I understood something painful but true. Sometimes, love becomes so familiar that people forget it's a choice. They forget it can hurt. They forget it can be lost. And sometimes, the people we love most are the ones who teach us the hardest lesson, that loving without being seen is still love. But it's a lonely kind. The weeks after Daniel's visit felt longer than usual. The days had grown colder, and the evenings arrived too early. Even the light in my apartment seemed weaker somehow, as if it too had decided to, give up. I kept telling myself to stay busy. I cleaned the same corners twice, rearranged the same books, wrote letters I'd never send. It's strange how the body learns to keep moving even when the heart doesn't. Every night before sleeping, I'd whisper a small prayer. Not for myself, but for Daniel, for Lily, for little Emma. I prayed that their home would always stay warm, that their hearts would never know the kind of loneliness I had begun to carry. One morning, I woke up feeling lightheaded. At first, I thought I'd just skipped breakfast the day before. But when I stood up, the room spun, and I had to hold the wall to stay steady. I brushed it off. Old age, I told myself. Nothing serious. By afternoon, I fainted. When I opened my eyes, I was in a hospital bed. The ceiling lights were too bright. A nurse stood nearby, smiling kindly. "You're awake," she said softly. "You had a dizzy spell, but you're okay now." I blinked, disoriented. "How long have I been here?" "Just a few hours. We called your son from the number we found in your wallet. He should be here soon." My heart ached with both relief and dread. Daniel. It took him 3 hours to arrive. When he walked into the room, he looked anxious, but also guilty. "Mom," he said quietly, "why didn't you tell me you weren't feeling well?" I smiled faintly. "I didn't want to worry you." He sat down beside the bed, rubbing his hands together. "Lily said you've been overexerting yourself again," he murmured. "You can't do that anymore. You need to take care of yourself." I nodded, though a small voice inside me whispered, "I've been taking care of everyone else my whole life." The doctor came in, explained something about low blood pressure and fatigue, told me I'd be fine with rest. Daniel stayed quiet through most of it. When the doctor left, he finally said, "Mom, I think you should come stay with us for a while, at least until you're better." The words almost didn't sound real. I stared at him. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "Lily, Reese, it'll be good for Emma too. She should spend time with her grandmother." For a moment, everything inside me softened. Maybe this was the chance I had been waiting for, a chance to belong again. When I arrived at their house 2 days later, Emma ran toward me with a small laugh. She was walking now, wobbly, curious, full of energy. Her tiny arms reached for me, and I lifted her up, tears filling my eyes. It was the first time she'd reached for me on her own. Lily smiled politely. "Welcome, Mom. We've set up the guest room for you." I thanked her, genuinely grateful. The room was small but cozy. A little bed, a vase of flowers, a soft blanket. It felt like home, or at least what I remembered home used to feel like. For the first few days, everything went well. I helped with small chores, folding laundry, cooking breakfast, rocking Emma to sleep. Lily seemed more relaxed around me, and Daniel often smiled when he saw us together. For the first time in years, I felt useful again. But good things, I've learned, are often fragile. It started with little things, misunderstandings too small to mention but too heavy to ignore. One morning, I made soup for lunch. When Lily tasted it, she said gently, "It's delicious, but Emma's not used to that much salt." I smiled and apologized, though inside I felt foolish, like a guest who had overstepped. Another day, I offered to clean Emma's room, but Lily said, "Don't worry, Mom. I have my own way of organizing things." Again, not unkind, just distant. Each correction was polite, but it reminded me that I didn't quite belong. One evening, Daniel came home late from work. He looked exhausted, his tie loose, his eyes heavy. I heated his dinner and placed it on the table. He thanked me softly, ate quietly, and then went straight to bed. I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at his empty plate, remembering when we used to talk about everything. His school days, his dreams, the stories he made up about clouds. Now we barely shared words, only gestures. Still, I told myself, this is enough. At least I'm here. Days turned into weeks. I began to notice things, the small silences between Daniel and Lily, the way they avoided talking in front of me. I wondered if my presence was causing tension. One night, I heard them arguing softly in the living room. Lily's voice, low but firm. "She means well, but it's too much. I can't breathe in my own home." Daniel's voice followed. "She's my mother, Lily. She needs us right now." Then silence. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed my things quietly, not wanting to cause any more trouble. But before I could leave, Daniel came into the room. "Mom, what are you doing?" "I think it's time I go home," I said softly. "You've done enough. I'm feeling much better now." He frowned. You don't have to go." "I do?" I replied gently. "Sometimes love means giving people space." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll drive you," he said. The drive was quiet. The road stretched long and empty, trees passing like old memories. When we reached my apartment, Daniel carried my bag upstairs. He placed it by the door, hesitated, then said, "Mom, I know we haven't been perfect, but please don't think we don't care." I smiled. "I never thought that, sweetheart." He nodded, looking unsure. Then he hugged me. A real hug. Not rushed, not polite. For the first time in a long while, I felt his heart against mine. When he pulled away, his eyes were wet. "I'll call you soon," he promised. And he did. For a while. A month later, everything changed. It was late evening when the phone rang. It was Daniel. His voice was trembling. "Mom, Lila, he's in the hospital." I felt the air leave my body. "What happened?" "There was an accident," he said, barely holding back tears. "She's hurt, but stable. Can you come?" Within an hour, I was there. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and fear. Daniel was sitting outside the emergency room, his face pale, his hands shaking. When he saw me, he stood up. "Mom!" His voice broke. I wrapped my arms around him, holding him like I used to when he was small and scared. "It's okay," I whispered. "She'll be okay." He cried silently into my shoulder. Lily had fractured her ribs and leg in a car accident. She would need weeks to recover. Without hesitation, I moved back into their house to help. This time, no one objected. I took care of Emma, cooked meals, cleaned, and sat by Lily's bed each night. At first, she was quiet, withdrawn, but slowly, she began to soften. One night, as I was adjusting her blanket, she said softly, "Thank you for being here." I smiled. Family takes care of each other, always. Tears filled her eyes. "I misjudged you," she whispered. "I thought you wanted to control everything. I didn't realize you just wanted to love us." I shook my head gently. "No apologies, dear. Sometimes love is misunderstood. That's all." She reached out and took my hand. In that moment, years of quiet tension melted away. Daniel began coming home earlier, helping with Emma, talking more. The house, once cold and heavy, began to feel alive again. There were laughter and simple meals, shared stories, and quiet gratitude. One evening, Daniel joined me on the porch. The sky was deep orange, fading into dusk. He looked at me for a long while before speaking. "Mom, I owe you an apology." I looked at him, surprised. "For what?" "For everything," he said quietly. "For not understanding, for calling you selfish, for forgetting who you are." Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. "Oh, Daniel," I whispered. "You were never unkind on purpose. You were just learning to be your own man. I understand." He shook his head. "No. You gave me everything, and I made you feel small. That's not something I can justify." I smiled through the tears. "It's something you can make better. That's all that matters now." He nodded slowly, emotion thick in his voice. "I want you to live with us," he said. "Not because you need help, but because we need you." That night, I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house. I thought about how strange life is, how it takes pain to teach us tenderness, how sometimes we lose what we love before we learn how to hold it right. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in years, I felt peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because love had found its way back home. Love doesn't always return in the way you expect. Sometimes it comes back humbled, slower, wiser. Sometimes it takes a long road through misunderstanding before it remembers the way home. And sometimes, when someone finally sees your heart, truly sees it, it feels like forgiveness you didn't even know you were waiting for.